My name is Laura Thompson. I'm 64 years old, and today, in a courtroom in Asheville, North Carolina, my dead husband's son stood up and called me a liar to my face. "She's not family," Charlie said, pointing at me like I was dirt on his shoe. "She's a stranger who married my father for his money." I'd fed that boy dinner for 18 years. I'd sat next to his hospital bed when he broke his leg at 19, holding a bag of ice on his ankle at 2 in the morning while his own father slept through the whole thing. I'd driven 3 hours to watch him graduate community college, clapped louder than anyone in that gym. And now he was standing in a $2,000 suit, paid for with money his father left him, calling me a stranger. That's the moment I knew exactly who Charlie really was. Not grieving, not confused, just greedy and willing to burn me down to get what he wanted. If you're watching this, drop the city you're watching from. You're not going to believe where this story ends up. 3 days before that, I was standing in my kitchen making coffee in the same chipped mug Robert bought me the year we got married. 22 years of Sunday dinners, of nursing him through 2 knee surgeries, of driving 4 hours round trip every week during his chemo so he wouldn't have to sit in that hospital room alone. 22 years of building a life so quiet and steady, I thought nothing could ever knock it down. Then, a man in a cheap tie knocked on my door and handed me an envelope like he was delivering a pizza. "Mrs. Thompson, you'll need to sign for this." Charlie was contesting the will. The papers called me a manipulator, said I isolated Robert from his only son, said I pushed for the marriage because I saw a sick, lonely man with money and no one watching out for him. I read the word undue influence so many times it stopped looking like English. I sat down at my kitchen table and read it twice because I couldn't believe the words were about me. I'd met Robert at a hardware store of all places. He was buying paint for a fence he never finished. I was 50 then, freshly divorced, working part-time at the library because I liked the quiet, liked being around people who didn't ask questions. He made me laugh for the first time in 2 years, standing in the paint aisle with a can in each hand, asking me which shade of gray looked less sad. That's it. That's the whole scandalous story Charlie's lawyer wanted to turn into a crime. The courthouse smelled like old carpet and coffee that had been sitting too long. I wore the navy dress I wore to Robert's funeral because it was the only good one I owned. My hands were sweating so bad, I left a mark on the wooden bench. Charlie was already at the table when I walked in, next to a lawyer with silver hair and a watch that cost more than my car. He didn't even glance my way, just kept talking low to Charlie, both of them laughing quietly about something, like this was already decided. "Mrs. Thompson," the lawyer said, not even looking up from his folder, "we'll try to keep this brief." I didn't have a lawyer. I couldn't afford the kind Charlie had, not without touching money that wasn't settled yet, money I hadn't even let myself think of as mine. I sat at that table alone, in a room built for people with money, feeling smaller by the second. The judge came in and the case started, and within the first 10 minutes, Charlie's lawyer had already called me an aging woman with no career, no education past high school, and no real understanding of what she married into. He said it slow, like he wanted every word to land. I sat there and took it, hands folded, face still, because that's what a librarian does. She stays quiet in the reading room, even when someone's tearing pages out of her book right in front of her. But something Charlie said next made my hands go cold. "She probably doesn't even know how much the estate is worth," he told the judge, almost laughing like the whole thing was a joke he was letting the room in on. A nobody. He had no idea. None. Because the woman he was calling a nobody used to stand in front of juries twice a week and take apart men far smarter and far more expensive than his lawyer. And Robert had known that. Robert had known exactly who I used to be, long before Charlie was even born into this family. And he'd left something behind to prove it, hidden in a place only I would think to look. The judge adjourned for the day. As I stood up to leave, legs shaking, I saw Charlie lean over to his lawyer, smiling like he'd already won, like the verdict was just a formality he was waiting to collect. He had no idea what was waiting for him in a locked drawer back at the house I'd shared with his father for over 20 years. And by tomorrow, neither the judge nor Charlie's fancy lawyer was going to be laughing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in Robert's old study, the one room in the house I hadn't touched since he died, surrounded by his law books from a career he'd walked away from before I ever met him. I poured a glass of the wine he'd been saving for a special occasion that never came, and I let myself feel the full weight of what had happened in that courtroom. A nobody. That's what Charlie called me in front of a judge, a room full of strangers, and probably half of Asheville by the time the local news picked it up. But I hadn't always been Laura Thompson, quiet widow, part-time librarian. Before I was any of that, I was Laura Voss, assistant district attorney for 11 years, then a defense attorney for 6 more after I got tired of watching good people get crushed by a system that didn't care how tired they were. I put that life down when I married my first husband, and I never quite picked it back up, not even after that marriage ended, not even after I met Robert. I told myself I was done with courtrooms. I told myself quiet was enough. Robert never made me feel small for walking away from it. If anything, he was the only person who ever asked me about it and actually listened to the answer. I met Charlie for the first time 2 months into dating his father. He was 17 then, angry in the specific way 17-year-olds get angry when their mother's been gone 3 years and their father's finally smiling again. He looked at me across that dinner table like I was something that had wandered into his house uninvited. "You're not my mom," he said, the very first thing he ever said to me before I'd even sat down. "I know," I told him. "I'm not trying to be." I meant it. I never tried to replace anybody. I just tried to be there. At his baseball games, standing at the fence because he told me not to sit near his friends. At his college graduation, clapping so hard my hands hurt because his father was too choked up to make a sound. At 2 in the morning in an emergency room, holding a bag of ice on a 19-year-old's ankle because his own father had fallen asleep in the waiting room chair and I didn't have the heart to wake him up. 18 years of that. 18 years of small things nobody puts in a will. And somewhere in there, I stopped being the woman who used to argue felony cases in front of a jury and started being just Robert's wife, just the woman who made the coffee and kept the house and sat quietly at family dinners while Charlie talked over me like I wasn't there. I let it happen. I let myself disappear into being needed by other people because it felt safer than being seen. Robert used to catch me sometimes, staring at his old law books on the shelf, and he'd say, "You know you could still argue circles around every lawyer in this city." I'd laugh it off. I always laughed it off. He wasn't laughing when he got sick. The last 6 months of his life, Charlie visited twice in 6 months, while I sat in that hospital room every single day holding Robert's hand through treatments that made him too weak to hold a fork. Charlie called sometimes, always short, always distracted, always somehow needing something, money for a car repair, money for rent, money he never once mentioned paying back. Robert saw it. He wasn't blind to who his son had become. 2 weeks before he died, propped up in that hospital bed, he took my hand and said something I didn't understand until 3 days ago in that courtroom. Laura, if Charlie ever gives you trouble after I'm gone, and I think he might, there's something in my desk, the bottom drawer. You'll know when you need it. I never asked what he meant. I was too busy trying to keep him breathing to think about paperwork. Sitting in that study with my wine going warm in my hand, I finally understood. I got up, crossed the room, and knelt in front of that bottom drawer. It was locked the way it had always been locked, and for the first time in 22 years, I actually looked for the key, really looked, instead of assuming it was just Robert being private the way he sometimes was. I found it taped to the underside of the drawer above it, small, brass, worn smooth. My hands were shaking so bad it took 3 tries to get it in the lock. The drawer opened with a soft click, and inside was a thick manila folder with my old name written across the front in Robert's handwriting. Laura Voss, a name I hadn't seen written down in over 20 years. I opened it, and the first thing that fell out was a newspaper clipping, yellowed at the edges, my own face staring back at me from a headline I barely remember giving. Underneath it was a letter, Robert's handwriting, shakier than I remembered, dated the week before he died. My dearest Laura. I stopped reading right there because my hands were shaking too hard to hold the page steady, and because some part of me already knew that whatever was in that letter was going to change everything I thought I understood about the man I loved and the fight I was about to walk back into. The letter shook in my hand so bad I had to set it down on the desk just to keep reading it. My dearest Lara, by the time you read this, I'll be gone, and I imagine Charlie will already be doing exactly what we both know he's capable of. I've watched you disappear into this family for 18 years, giving up every piece of yourself for a boy who never once said thank you. I let you disappear because you seemed happy, and because I was too selfish to ask you to be anyone other than the woman who stayed by my side. But I never forgot who you really are. I kept every clipping. I watched you win cases on the local news before we ever met, years before I knew your name meant something to half the lawyers in this state. Laura Voss doesn't disappear just because she stopped wearing a suit to work. If Charlie challenges this will, you fight him with everything you were before you were my wife. Don't you dare shrink yourself for that boy one more day. All my love, always, Robert. I sat in that study until the sun came up, going through every piece of paper in that folder. Case clippings, a photo of me at 34, standing outside the courthouse in a suit that fit like armor. A letter of recommendation from a judge who used to make grown men sweat. Underneath it all, at the very bottom, was something I hadn't expected. Copies of bank statements and a note in Robert's handwriting listing every loan he had given Charlie over 12 years. Cars, rent, a business that folded in 4 months, over $90,000, none of it ever repaid. All of it carefully documented like Robert knew someday it would matter. By the time the sun came up, I wasn't the woman who'd sat quiet at that table the day before. I opened my laptop, the one Robert had insisted I learn to use for online banking and nothing else, and for the first time in over 20 years, I searched case law. Undue influence, burden of proof, testamentary capacity. My fingers moved faster than my brain could keep up with, muscle memory clawing its way back after 2 decades asleep. Charlie's case wasn't strong. It never had been. It was built on the assumption that nobody would push back, that a quiet widow in a Navy funeral dress would just sit there and take it. He had no idea who he was about to face. I walked back into that courtroom the next morning wearing the same navy dress, but I didn't feel small in it anymore. Charlie was already at his table, whispering with his lawyer, that same easy smirk on his face like the outcome was already decided. He glanced at me once, quick and dismissive, the way you'd glance at furniture. "All rise." The judge came in, and Charlie's lawyer wasted no time picking up right where he left off, going after my lack of career, my limited education, painting me as a woman who latched on to a dying man out of desperation. "Your Honor," he said, "we'd like to call Mrs. Ellis, a neighbor of the Thompsons, to the stand." An older woman I recognized from 2 houses down took the oath, refusing to meet my eyes. She testified that she'd once overheard me crying on my porch, saying I was scared of what would happen once Robert was gone. "And did she mention money specifically?" the lawyer asked, practically smiling. "She said she was scared to be alone," Mrs. Ellis admitted, quieter now. "No further questions." The judge looked my way. "Mrs. Thompson, do you wish to cross-examine?" I stood up, and for the first time in 20 years, I felt the old rhythm come back to my spine. "Mrs. Ellis," I said, walking toward the stand, slow and steady, the way I used to when I wanted a jury to lean forward. "Mrs. Ellis, you said I was crying on my porch. Do you remember what day that was?" She blinked, thrown by the question. I'm not sure exactly." "Let me help. It was the same day Robert's doctor told us the treatments had stopped working, the same day we found out he had maybe 6 weeks left." I let that sit in the air. "Was I crying because I was scared of losing money, Mrs. Ellis, or because I was scared of losing my husband?" Her face went pale. Because he was dying." "Thank you. No further questions." I felt it the moment I sat back down, the shift in the room. Charlie's lawyer wasn't smiling anymore. Charlie himself had stopped whispering, staring at me now like he was seeing me for the first time. The judge called the next witness, Robert's financial advisor, and I cross-examined him too, calm and precise, pulling apart every claim about sudden changes to the estate, until the man admitted, under oath, that Robert had been organizing his finances for over a year, clear-headed and deliberate, long before any so-called manipulation could have started. By the lunch recess, Charlie's lawyer looked like a man watching his own case fall apart in real time. As I gathered my folder to step out, the judge cleared his throat. "Mrs. Thompson, before we recess, for the record, I'll need your full legal name." My stomach dropped because I knew exactly what was about to happen, and there was no version of this where Charlie walked out of that courtroom the same person who walked in. "Laura Voss Thompson, Your Honor, but there's a chance you might recognize the first part." The look on the judge's face told me he already had. The judge set down his pen slow, like he needed a second to make sure he'd heard right. "Lara Voss?" he repeated. "As in the Lara Voss who prosecuted the Kessler fraud case before you moved into defense work?" The courtroom went quiet in that specific way a room goes quiet when everyone realizes they've been watching the wrong story unfold. "That's right, Your Honor," I said. Charlie's head snapped toward his lawyer, mouthing something I didn't need to hear to understand. His lawyer was flipping through his own file like the answer was hiding somewhere in the pages he clearly hadn't read closely enough. "Your Honor," the lawyer said, voice tighter now, "this is the first we're hearing of any legal background. We'd like to request a recess to—" "To what, counselor?" the judge asked. "Investigate the woman you've spent 2 days calling uneducated?" I watched something in Charlie's face crack open. Not surprise exactly, something closer to fear. For 18 years he'd known me as the quiet woman who made his father's coffee and sat 2 feet behind him at every family event, easy to talk over, easy to dismiss. He never once asked what I did before I married his father. He never asked because he never thought there was anything worth asking about. "We conducted a standard background check, Your Honor," the lawyer said. "There was no record of any current legal practice." "Because I retired and took my late husband's name," I said. "But my bar license is still active. I've kept up every requirement. I am, in fact, fully qualified to represent myself in this matter, and I intend to." The judge allowed a short recess, and the second the room cleared, Charlie came straight for my table, his face red, his voice shaking. "You've been lying to me for 18 years, he said. "You let me think you were just—" "Just what, Charlie? Just a nobody? That's the word you used yesterday in front of a room full of strangers." He didn't have an answer for that. When court resumed, his lawyer tried to call Charlie to the stand himself, hoping a sympathetic story might undo the damage. It backfired worse than anything that came before. "Tell the court about your relationship with your father in his final year," the lawyer said, gentle, coaching. "He shut me out," Charlie said, working up real tears now. "I couldn't even get time alone with him." I stood to cross-examine, and for the first time since this trial started, my hands weren't shaking at all. "Charlie, you testified you visited your father twice in his 6 months. Is that accurate?" Things were complicated. I have his calendar. I have the phone records for that period, submitted as evidence this morning." I held up the folder. "Would you like to tell the court how many times you called him?" He said nothing. "3 times, Charlie. 3 calls in 6 months, none longer than 4 minutes. Meanwhile, I have documentation of $91,000 your father loaned you over 12 years for a car, for rent, for a business that closed in 4 months, none of which was ever repaid. That has nothing to do with this." "It has everything to do with this. You've spent 2 days telling this court I isolated you from your father. I'm going to ask you the same question I asked myself last night staring at these bank statements. Were you kept away from him, or did you simply stop showing up once he stopped being useful to you?" Charlie's face crumpled, and for a second I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "You don't understand what it was like watching him love you the way he never—" He stopped himself. Too late. "The way he never loved you?" I finished for him. "Charlie, your father loved you. I watched him agonize over every unpaid loan, every missed call, hoping you'd come around. He never stopped hoping. But hope isn't the same as blindness, and it seems your father saw exactly who you'd become, because 2 weeks before he died, he had something prepared for exactly this moment." The courtroom went still. "Your Honor," I said, turning to the bench, "I'd like to submit one final piece of evidence, a recorded statement made by Robert Thompson 3 weeks before his death, addressed directly to this court." Charlie's lawyer shot up. "Objection, Your Honor, we've had no opportunity to review." "It was filed with the court clerk this morning, along with the rest of my evidence, Counselor. You had the same access I did." The judge studied the two of us for a long moment before he spoke. "I'll allow it. Play the recording." I set the tablet on the evidence stand, my hands finally steady, and pressed play, and Robert's voice, weak but certain, filled a courtroom that had spent 2 days calling me a nobody. Robert's voice came through the speaker, thin but steady, the voice of a man who knew exactly how much time he had left and had decided to spend some of it protecting me. "My name is Robert Thompson, and I'm recording this on the 4th of March of sound mind in case my son decides to do exactly what I suspect he will." Charlie's face had gone the color of ash. "Lara never asked me for anything in 18 years, not once. I'm the one who asked her to give up parts of herself for this family, and she did it without complaint, even when my son treated her like hired help in her own home. I've watched Charlie borrow money he never intended to repay, miss birthdays, miss hospital visits, and then show up smiling the moment he needed something. I love my son. I will always love my son, but I am not blind, and I will not let him rewrite the truth once I'm not here to say otherwise. Everything I own I leave to Lala, not because she manipulated me, because she earned every bit of it in ways my son never bothered to notice. If he's sitting in a courtroom right now trying to prove otherwise, I hope someone plays him this recording and lets him hear one more time his father telling him no." The recording ended. Nobody in that courtroom moved. Charlie sat frozen at his table, his lawyer beside him, staring down at his useless folder of papers like it might rearrange itself into something that could still save the case. "Your Honor," I said, "I'd also like to enter into evidence documentation of $91,000 of unpaid loans, along with 3 years of correspondence showing Robert Thompson was of sound mind, financially organized, and fully aware of his son's pattern of behavior long before his diagnosis. I'm asking this court to uphold the will as written, dismiss all claims of undue influence, and order repayment of the outstanding loans as part of the estate accounting." Charlie's lawyer stood up slower than I'd ever seen a man stand. "Your Honor," he said, "given the evidence presented, we'd like to withdraw the claim of undue influence." "Denied," the judge said, before I'd even opened my mouth. "This court doesn't let claims like this simply disappear once they stop being convenient, counselor. Your client made serious public accusations against a widow's character. I intend to rule on the full record." He turned to me. "Mrs. Thompson, anything further?" I stood, looked at Charlie one last time, not with anger anymore, just clarity, and said, "No, Your Honor, I think the record speaks for itself." The judge took 20 minutes. When he came back, he didn't waste words. "This court finds no evidence of undue influence, manipulation, or diminished capacity on the part of Robert Thompson. The will stands as written in its entirety. Furthermore, based on documentation submitted, this court orders Charles Thompson to repay the $91,000 owed to his father's estate, with interest calculated from the date each loan was issued. Case dismissed." Charlie didn't say a word. He just sat there while his lawyer packed up beside him, alone in a courtroom that had turned against him the second the truth came out.
I didn't wait around for an apology. I didn't get one, and I stopped expecting one somewhere around the third time he called me a nobody in public. 6 months later, my name is back on a law office door, 2 blocks from that same courthouse. Lara Voss Thompson, attorney at law. I take cases now for women exactly like the woman I was 3 days before that trial started. Women who gave up careers, gave up names, gave up pieces of themselves for families that decided later it was convenient to forget. Charlie moved out of state. I heard he's still paying off that $91,000 a little at a time, garnished straight from his paycheck. We haven't spoken since the verdict, and I've made my peace with that. Some relationships don't get a second chapter. Some people spend so long proving who they really are that eventually you have to believe them. Robert knew who Charlie was long before I let myself see it, and he knew who I still was even after 18 years of me forgetting it. I walk into that courthouse now the same way I did 20 years ago, not as anyone's wife, not as anyone's stepmother, not as any nobody. Just Lara Voss, back where she started, exactly where she belongs. Now I want to hear from you. If you were in my place, would you have fought as hard as I did or walked away? Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story traveled. And if you liked this one, stick around. There are 2 more stories on your screen right now that this channel's audience can't stop talking about.